Hi, welcome to the Knowledge Addict. I'm with my co-host Christian Barber, and my name is Harlequin. You can find me at Twitter at infant_Cthulhu, and we're basically gonna be riffing today. This is our first podcast, and we might be riffing, but we won't cause a continental drift.
I might be grifting. I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna steal a lot of things from a lot of people today. Just mostly their pride and dignity and self-respect.
Self-respect.
Just because I lost mine and
I'm still trying to find it. Now maybe I can get a fortune cookie. Might set me on the right path. No, actually, I never met a gypsy. Have you met a gypsy?
only in my travels.
Only my travels.
No, I feel like I actually am Romanian, like part Romanian, so I kind of have gypsy blood in me. I hear that a lot of Romanians are gypsies.
I hear the gypsy blood goes for a high price in the black market.
And you're black, so there we go. Black gypsies, hashtag life goals. Yeah.
So, has anything interesting happened at work?
Oh, actually, today it's the first time I've seen this, and I've been wanting to see this since I started there, like 4 months. I work staff aug for an IT company. I'm like looking at that, not the camera. Hello, me. But yeah, there's a fight that kind of broke out, and they didn't get into a fist fight, but it was like a yelling match, and it was so funny because it started out with like this shorter black dude, and then like this taller black dude, and the taller black dude was effeminate, like maybe gay, but he was like super confident. And the shorter black dude like was trying really hard to show how thuggish he was, and like at first he was actually intimidated by the taller black dude, and that dude was just like really laid back. He's like I will punch you in the face. Like he just like letting the kid know, and that was like pissed him off because there was girls around, and I feel like he was trying to impress them. And it was funny because while there weren't adults there, like nothing was happening. But as soon as the adults showed up, the shorter guy like recognized that he was kind of insulated by authority, and so he like amped it up and like really started like putting on a show. And it was funny because he had like this little juice box, and he like got mad and slapped it. And I just thought about how funny that image was. Just like you try to look gangster, but you're slapping a juice box like a little
Like,
kid.
don't drink Capri Sun. It's getting dangerous out here.
Yeah, he's like, I drink Capri Suns, but you wear capris, son. And no, but it was really funny because I actually had more sympathy with the taller, possibly gay. The thing is, I don't know that the guy's actually gay. The reason I say this is I've seen the taller dude who, by all means, dresses and acts like a straight guy, but I have seen him braiding the girl's hair and stuff like that. And then this littler guy get on the phone, and he's like, yo, we gotta take care of this. And he's saying it in front of the dude. He's like, we gotta take care of this dude. He goes, yeah, the one that always acts gay and stuff like that. And so I was like, well, maybe he is gay. But it was funny because the other dude was so confident. He was just like, I really don't give a shit. Like, this will go down. And it reminded me of something when I was in high school. There was a gay black kid that was getting picked on by like, a jocular like football kind of guy. And that dude picked a fight with him, and the gay dude beat his ass. And so I was like, "Ooh, this is gonna be round two. I get to see this again, like in my life." And, but it didn't go down because adults showed up. But it was just funny because this guy definitely had a Napoleon complex, and it was super.
Yeah, even though he's saying that adults showed up, he counts as a Benjamin Button status.
He totally does. He was acting like an adult in a little man's
I
body.
mean, I meant you because
Me?
Because you said no adults showed up, but you're watching.
Oh no, dude. I actually had a moral dilemma in myself because I was totally the irresponsible adult in that situation. I was gonna watch the fight. Like I was not gonna break it up. First of all, I don't technically work for the school, so like it just would be weird if I'd be intervening as a civilian adult, and I'm just like I wouldn't do that with teenagers on the street. I'm not gonna do it even at my job. Like it's not my job.
Just got your phone out, World Star.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like I didn't get my phone out, but I was thinking I was watching it like a show.
Because remember, phones aren't allowed in school. Stay learning.
But yeah, you could tell that I was definitely analyzing the psychology of what was happening, and it was pretty funny.
Now, I am personally in a program called MSBK. So Monday I was sitting around, and one of the projects is that there's a military guy called Derek Rose that is coming to do resilience training. So the mentor is basically like look up some current events. This is what we're gonna be quizzed on Thursday. So basically, mostly when I'm there, a lot of the kids don't pay attention. It's kind of just like, okay, we're just here to be on the computers and stuff like that while we're looking for job placement. So the mentor, he was like, oh, give me two current events that you've been watching. He was just like, what, sir? Oh, I don't know. I'd just be thinking too fast, so I'd be forgetting. And I was just like, he obviously was not paying attention.
Yeah. That reminds me of the Bill Hicks joke where he's talking about being in a philosophy course, and the professor comes out and he says, today you will be learning that we are all a collective conscious, subjectively examining itself, and we're all one and connected. And he goes, and the kid in the back of the class raises his hand and goes, is that going to be on the quiz? That kind of reminds me of the same thing, just like not getting the material, not paying attention.
Yeah, you got that hypotenuse.
There was this fat girl in high school that fell asleep at her desk when I was in school, and like it was like quiet, we were like taking a test or something like that, or maybe like a pop quiz, and she like had her head on the desk and was asleep like this and like farted like an audible like. But she had the best cover up I've ever seen. She farted and she goes, start beating on the table like, and it's pretty funny because she definitely farted. And
she definitely farted.
Yeah.
Now
it's like you can cover the sound, but you can't obscure the smell.
Can't obscure the smell.
She should have been spritzing like what?
You smelt it, you dealt it. Unless you fly Delta.
I could spit and spritz.
Now, me and Christian, we are pursuing a stand-up comedy career, and basically, and basically, you could find us at the Comedy Works on Friday at 9:00. But if you're just like us and also an aspiring comedian, it's best to get yourself out there in any way possible. Would you have any tips for a aspiring comedian in this day and age?
Don't do it.
Don't do it?
Yeah. We're full. We don't need any more.
Yeah, sign-ups, no.
Yeah, it's packed. There's enough comedians. Enough. In fact, after you see this podcast, don't do any more podcasts. Just don't even enter. Yeah, that's my only advice to anybody that feels like they should start. Don't. We're already here. We don't need competition. The competition's fierce enough.
Yeah, there's already #MeToo movement. We don't need any more people.
I'm surprised there's not like a #Mewtwo movement for Pokemon Go players. That was a really horrible dad joke, but I am a dad.
So it works out.
That's right.
Now, personally, I can't claim any dad jokes, but I can claim uncle jokes.
Remember when, I feel like kids don't do this anymore, by the way, but when I was a kid, and I'm sure like many decades before that, a bully would get you in a hold and be like, say uncle. Do you remember that? Does that ever happen? Like, do you remember seeing that? I saw that.
Now, I remember when I was in math class once, one of the known assholes of the school, he tried to put me in the headlock, but like, no, I did martial arts training, so I reversed it on him. But then you see the teachers called Mr. Forehand, he just starts coming out, I was like, no, stop. But since he was a wrestling coach, I thought he was going to be like, 1, 2, 3.
It'd be fun if you found out he wasn't circumcised and you start calling him Mr. Foreskin.
I know he stole my foreskin.
What'd be funny is like if you got raped by your uncle and he was like, say my name, and you're like, uncle. That was fucking dark.
We're going to get very dark in this podcast, even darker than me. So, yeah. Now,
don't let my skin fool you. I'm dark.
Have you heard anything did you hear about how scientists think that they have figured out dark matter?
The only evidence I've seen about dark matter was years ago. They were talking about gravitational lensing and how that shows that dark matter exists based on the bending of solar light in the universe, open space, I guess. And so they've observed this gravitational lensing that they say can only happen if some kind of matter or energy is interplaying with the photons, and I don't know. That's the evidence I've heard, but I don't know. What are you talking about?
Well, there's been a lot of recent discoveries, especially with the Hadron Collider with CERN. But public service announcement: if you're a virgin, don't worry because your atoms are smashing.
Oh, nice. That reminds me of this really stupid joke I have, and I just really want to say it until some biologist gets it and it just starts clapping. In one of my stand-ups, yeah, just a slow clap. But gametes, which are reproductive cells, sex cells, I was saying or thinking that you could actually advertise with gametes because sex sells. More dad jokes. Highbrow dad jokes.
If any of you guys are marketers, remember you got it from him.
That's right. You gotta give him credit and royalties.
I agree with the royalties.
That's right. I'll kill you off some for making sure that they all do that.
Okay.
Can you imagine if like biologists were just like, I just started collecting checks and like, what's happening here? And they're like, in the sake of science, we are giving you your. Well, actually, I would not want that because that would mean that they're actually effective with their marketing campaign.
We got shit to learn.
You don't want people hijacking your biology to advertise to you. We're already hijacking people's psychologies.
Now, I feel like they kind of already are because like now it's the data information. Like I feel like if anything, we should be getting royalties from the data that say Facebook is selling or Google is selling. But because of, well, I mean, guess like because we aren't reading the terms and conditions, that we don't really got any play with that. But I feel like that's one thing Bernie Sanders should add to his campaign.
Yeah. In that same vein, there is a documentary that came out recently, and I think there's been books written about it, especially by the people in the documentary. But it's about facial recognition software and how it's being used to find criminals by police enforcement. And this is real. It is inherently racist for whatever reason. I don't know if it's the developers and the algorithms they use or whatever it is, but it does not properly identify black people. Like it has a lower success rate of distinguishing individual black people, whereas white people, it can find their individual characteristics and pinpoint them better. And on one hand, and it's already being used in the UK, and on one hand, it's useful because if you're accused of a crime, somebody else could get pinned for it. But that same thing can also happen to you randomly, and then all of a sudden you're, subject to this. Anyway, and it's being used in China for sure, like heavily in China.
Do you feel worried about where technology is going, especially with like AI popping up and becoming more prevalent?
Yeah, I actually have my own. I would call it a philosophy, but I think it's got a scientific merit to it, kind of based on what I was telling about David Hume's induction principle or problem. It's funny because if you follow epistemological philosophy about how people acquire knowledge and what knowledge means, you have two different views, which is you've got empirical or rational ways of deducing information and knowledge. Induction is more of an empirical approach because it relies more on sensory observation, visual, auditory, just anything with your five senses, which I feel like clearly we have seen enough brain science that shows that our minds are actually tricking us. Our senses cannot be that reliable. So while it's good to confirm things empirically, I think you have to have a rational basis for it as well. And a lot of people consider Hume an empiricist, but I think he was a rationalist because he pointed out the induction problem. Bringing this back to big data, I think big data is brute force, and you can draw any connection if you have a large enough data set. So I feel like a lot of people's biases are being justified by big data when really you can draw any connection with big data. One example is a lot of generals that are using metadata to track terrorists in the Middle East end up accidentally droning families of terrorists and finding secondary people based on the metadata that actually have nothing to do with the terrorist crimes, and they're killing civilians. And generals have actually complained about this to military intelligence, but we continue these drone campaigns. And for me, I just see a big danger in relying on empirical science without any rationality.
Now, my problem with the whole drone strikes and attacks is that only 60% actually, there's like a big percent of attacks that aren't even hitting their targets. So there's so many drone operators just out there in Arizona that are having PTSD because they know that they're actually hitting innocents.
Right.
But at the same time, we are relying on those attacks to really prove that we're actually fighting the insurrection, and I feel like more people should really look into that because they're just like
the insurgents.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that that's one of their excuses, that the data helps them identify insurgents, I think. But I think the actual empirical evidence shows that that is incorrect, and I think it's because they're coming at it from the wrong rationalization. First of all, what designates a terrorist? Don't we already have... So there's a lot of pragmatism in the U.S. In fact, pragmatic philosophy came from the U.S. It came from Charles Peirce and William James and John Dewey. And pragmatism tries to... It's another, actually, epistemological science or philosophy that tries to find out the nature of truth and knowledge by saying that what's useful is true. But what's useful, that term is subjective to me, because, especially with humans, there's a lot of hubris built into the human worldview, and I think that's true of any species that is going to optimize its survival. A lot of times we excuse things because we can do them, and it's not necessarily that we should. Like, people oftentimes take an ought from an is. So, like, a lot of people will point to hierarchies in the natural order and say that that justifies authoritarianism. But there's also mutualism and synergy and collectivism. Those are also things that exist. And so if you find it useful to have an authoritarian viewpoint, that doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's true either.
That is true.
Yeah. And so, I don't know how you can... I personally don't think that... So, like, a lot of domestic issues are the same thing as they are foreign. There are Muslims all over the world. It's the fastest growing world religion. Not all of them are terrorists. In fact, a minority of them are terrorists. So to paint the Middle East and Muslims as being the ideological force of terrorism, I think, is incorrect, because there are other Muslims in other places, in more democratic places, where they actually have sound infrastructure and central authorities that regulate environments. And so really it's a lack of civilization allowed to flourish in the Middle East because of our involvement and our control of resources and the way that they get... Us telling the rest of the world and policing them and telling them how they should develop assumes that we have the best viewpoint. I don't think that's true. And the reason I pointed to the domestic thing is a lot of people will point to the hood or some poor ghetto or try and accuse the people in those communities as being lazy or violent or whatever it is, but largely it's because they don't have opportunities. They don't have infrastructure. I get mad when people say, oh, they should get a job, and it's like, well, what jobs are available to them? And then they'll say, well, maybe they should move where there is a job. Like, how does that fix the ghetto? You know what I mean? So, like, the thing is the real thing is, instead of war and aggression in the Middle East, we should show people we're the good guys by helping them develop their economies and not using the IMF and World Bank and independent contractors from the U.S. use their own markets to regulate themselves. That way they have their own stable authorities and they can decide for themselves. But we don't like that. America has a hegemony. We don't want people thinking for themselves. I'm sure I'm going to make everybody mad in our first podcast.
But there's a lot of good points, but like really where it's not Trump is bringing away he's focusing like, oh, it's all Muslims that are the problem, but it's really actually people whose fathers were killed by drone strikes, or really their sons, and they're trying to fight against what they think is the greater evil. But bringing back to your point about the ghettos and how people are saying like, well, you should just get a job or you should move out, or is see a lot of people as just reaping government benefits without adding anything to the bigger picture. You really is just more than that, because like Malcolm X spoke it literally. It's just like, keep the money within your own black community, but also we really need to change our mindset, because a lot of when I talk about starting a business, a lot of people tell me, oh, that's white people shit. But what does that actually mean? It's just that, one, if we really want a great, we need to take back through building our own businesses, helping our own people, because, if people are being racially profiled and not getting the jobs, there's quite a few black millionaires, but they're really forgetting where they came from, and they're not actually trying to give back. They're not putting in the programs or putting in the policies of trying to give back jobs to people who need it and stuff like that. Because for example, in the area, there's a coffee shop that hires only autistic people, and I feel like that is a great step, because one is giving them the ability to work. A lot of people probably would, even though that they say they don't profile your resume, that they probably will not give a lot of people the chance, especially if they have a mental disability, to actually be able to work and gain that valuable life experience that they would need to, say, go on their own or have disposable income.
I don't want to put words in your mouth or assume thoughts out of your head that you haven't said, but I could see some points, and I'll just go by them one at a time. The white people shit with businesses, it depends on how you run your business. I think all businesses, white or black or whatever they are, should be community driven.
Yes.
If you do employ people, they should have a share in the company. They should have some kind of ownership, and they should be able to make decisions, own the means of production, and not have someone who does start a business tell them how they should work, when they can work, and what they're going to get from it. They should be able to dictate their own terms. That's true of everyone. I think that would fix a lot of issues. But there's evidence from Asian businesses usually employ their own families, and they do end up being in the higher income brackets. And I don't think it has to do with race. I think it has to do with the way that they organize themselves. And even that is too isolated, though. And this will bring me to the next point about the autism thing, which I think is good to include autistic people in the workforce. But I feel like there's almost a reverse segregation that inadvertently happens if you do start employing people by their identity.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that the real answer is to integrate. And who gives a fuck if you're autistic, a woman, black, whatever it is. Embrace them all, but have it be more democratic inside the workplace, where they get an equal voice. And so my biggest thing is to include all people in all markets and all businesses, but have them all have an equal voice. And that's the problem, is we don't give people an equal voice. And a lot of times to combat that, you do have to create these isolated movements, because exactly like you said, on one hand, the problem is you don't have an embracing of autistic people. So to defend them and insulate them from that prejudice, it probably would be a good thing to have a business that empowers them, because they're not going to get it in the way that the structure is now. And so I struggle a lot with combating the structure as it is, and then trying to create a new structure, or a new system, if you want to call it that. And I've thought about starting my own business myself, but to do it, it would be a very slow and costly process for me, because I would want to do it right. It'd be real easy to get a loan or a grant. I could literally get a grant from the town of Glenville and start a business. They have their own stipulations. I'd have to fit whatever they say, but they'll just give me money to start a business. You and I don't get given money to go to school, or there's no such thing as a laborer millionaire. You can't have a 9-to-5 job and get $1 million as a salary. Only way to get $1 million and above is, and in fact, you can't even get more than $200,000 as a laborer. Only way to do it is to actually own capital and own assets that are that derive capital, meaning profit. And the problem is we don't distribute property ownership, asset ownership, capital things. People don't have control over the means of production, so they are the means of production. You're literally owned by a business when you go somewhere. You're seen as a fixed asset, a cost, and incremental salaries that they know that some of them have a raise, and there's some contract that you're assigned to, but they tell you what work you're going to do. They tell you what it's going to be worth, and a lot of times you're actually getting a impotent workforce. And I do this myself. If I'm not going to get paid more for working harder, why the fuck would I do it? And so a lot of people want to say that they're not getting enough out of their workforce. Maybe you should pay them. Maybe you should have them more involved. But that's my. I try to think of things holistically, and I think one of the problems is we create so many factional divides and fractional by isolating things based on identity or culture, when really the real problem is the way that the system is.
Especially like just bringing back to your point of means of ownership. A lot of our products are coming from China. We're also selling inferior products at the same time. To bring my point is that we really need to just be focusing on domestic ownership, bringing back just so many industrial towns, like the town of Troy, which is right by Albany, was an industrial city, but now it's completely dead because a lot of the workforce is now going overseas. And at the same point, if you're cutting costs that much, you can also afford to pay your employees more. But bringing back to your point about you starting your business, do you see yourself doing that in the future?
No. I can't say no definitively, because one of the reasons I say no right now is I've got kids that are young. I've got time is more important to me right now, and we're working on comedy, and comedy is a very individual thing, and I personally, to fully expose myself, I'm an anarchist. I believe in distribution of power, collapsing of hierarchies, no rulers. That's what anarchy actually means, is no rulers in Greek. And so to start a business, if I had a few people that were willing to start with me and they had the same ideology, which I think is going to be rare, that they don't mind sharing profit, I think every business should be a co-op. So for me, I'm going to pause that. You want to pause it real quick? And I'm going to stop whatever that noise is, and then I think we should have a cigarette.
Welcome back. Basically, we were talking about Joe Rogan and how we kind of just feel that he kind of just generalizes too many things. And what was your good point about?
Well, I remember in a podcast he had Sam Harris on, and they were talking about socialism, and they just dismissed it outright, which is funny to me, because when he had Bernie Sanders on, all of a sudden he thought socialism was a good idea. So what he generalized with Sam Harris was, isn't socialism stupid? Because a lot of people that are against socialism have iPhones. And it really, that doesn't make a point. That doesn't say anything. Because you can have an iPhone or socialism. In fact, an iPhone itself has GPS. That was developed in the public sector. It has TCP/IP. That was developed in the public sector. All these things were made outside of profit-earning companies, inside of college institutions or think tanks that were government-funded, meaning tax-funded institutions. So everything that makes an iPhone work was actually done with socialism. And that was the ignorance on their part, to not acknowledge that and to assume that an iPhone is entirely a capital enterprise. All it is it's a shiny package on top of something that was made by the labor of people who just wanted to create something. Not everybody creates something because there's some material gain. And so what he generalized, and where Sam Harris agrees with me, is he goes, socialism doesn't onboard well with people's greed, and capitalism does, but that's assuming that everyone acts in a self-motivated interest towards material ends. And I personally think that, yes, people act in self-motivated interest, but it's not always a material reason. It could be immaterial. It could be you want to do something nice because you have a conviction that you, or altruistic, that you put yourself in harm's way because you know you can't live with yourself if you don't. And so there's a selfish motivation that you do that because you have a selfish need to care about other people. It doesn't. Selfishness does not mean material greed. It's a very narrow point of view that is part of the state religion. So it's funny because Sam Harris talks about being an atheist, but he believes in the state religion. He thinks that what we're doing in the Middle East is good. But if he was to turn it around and have the Middle East be the power that can actually, the only reason we're even able to do what we can do in the Middle East is because we have the power to do it. If someone else had that power and was doing it to us, we would not say it was good.
I feel like that really just shows the hypocrisy about our mindset. It's just that as long as it's not happening to us, it's okay. And it happens with no matter what. Like you see it in the news quite often. But what that kind of reminded me of is how you were talking about how things were created in the public sector. Is that I heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about this, but how scientists and military advancements kind of work hand in hand, especially with like the telescope. The Hubble telescope was meant to be like a military project, and even from like when Galileo was trying to get funding, he kind of went to the kings to
Right.
to market the telescope as to be able to see foreign ships attacking your land.
Uh-huh.
And even today, like a lot of things, scientists are just trying to create funding, so that's kind of like showing the selfishness that we also have, especially with like we will sacrifice our own beliefs just to get our own ends, means to an end.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson actually takes the opposite justification that I would take, because he actually uses it as a reason to support militarism. I would say that you could do it without militarism. I've had correspondence with Noam Chomsky, and I remember asking how we could be efficient with pharmaceuticals without a pharmaceutical industry. How could we get drugs to market? And he said a very relevant point, which is most of those drugs, the technical aspects of them, are developed in the public sector at the National Institute of Health, and that you could actually cut out the distributor, which would be the private company, and just use the NIH to not only develop and produce, but also distribute those goods, and it would be paid for by tax dollars. And the thing is I personally don't mind a few percentage points more of my income going to social goods and services that I believe in. I find it odd that a lot of people that own property don't want to pay school taxes if they don't have kids, but don't you want an educated populace? Like
That's actually a good argument to that, towards that like aspect of it, because like even I've had that thought. It's just like, why is my mom paying and I'm out of school? But at the same point, we wouldn't want like programs being cut because of the taxes or education being jeopardized. And also, since we're ranked 40th in education, we kind of also want that, if America's number one, we should also be focusing on education.
Yeah. And I'll expose myself as a gerontophobe. I personally have a problem with a lot of geriatrics, a lot of older people that are holding on to antiquated points of view and accepting things like Social Security, but then not wanting to pay for school. And a lot of these people that were able to progress themselves had free state college tuition that is no longer available. So the very thing that got them to the point where they can have retirement and accept Social Security, they want to stop other people from having. And so for me, you may not want to pay for your school taxes. I don't want to pay Social Security. I don't give a fuck about you if you're not for health care for all. I don't care about your. First of all, what are old people contributing to society at some level? I compare them to senescent cells. Senescent cells are cells that die, and without autophagy, which is a process of clearing of dead cells.
Okay.
It actually causes cancer and causes sicknesses in people. And a lot of times I think old people can be a cancer on society. They can be, not saying that they are, because there are clearly old people. Noam Chomsky would be a good example. Bernie Sanders, another good one, that have progressive viewpoints that we should support and we should get behind. And not to say that they deserve Social Security and the other ones don't. I think they all deserve Social Security, but I also think everyone deserves school funding. It really comes down to a set of values, and America prioritizes values for everybody else. Antonio Gramsci, who was a political dissident and a prisoner under Mussolini in a fascist regime, wrote about something he called cultural hegemony. And cultural hegemony says that the totalitarianism that is enforced on people and indoctrinated people happens from the media, the cultures that they grow up in. And America has a very strident culture of authoritarianism. There's another book I have that says, "Thank God They're on our side," and it talks about how America actually supported Mussolini and Hitler before they...
For the more radical side, sorry, from that.
Well, we support right-wing dictatorships all over the world because they control their populace for our national interest. And there's a good argument that is true. The northern states exploit the resources of the southern states. So you've got Europe that exploits resources from Africa. You've got America that exploits resources from South America. Why? We have more of a frozen ground, less agriculture can be developed in our hardened soil. All of the oil that we get is from either the Middle East. The coffee, Germany's biggest export is coffee. They don't fucking grow coffee. They get that from Africa. But that's their largest export. It should be Africa's largest export, but they own the means of production, and they own the businesses that grow coffee inside of Africa. And we do the same thing with palm oil in America. And you have these multinational corporations that are extracting resources, whether it be Southeast Asia, China, wherever it is all over the world. And a lot of our GDP is increasingly not domestic. It's from other countries. And then you outsource jobs. Basically, we've got slave labor running everything. And it's not getting the control of the means of production. And so it's actually stuck working for people who are profiting off of slavery. But we don't call it slavery. And because we don't call it slavery, people don't recognize that labor has become slavery over time. It's become a way of manufacturing for other people's profit. You should own the profit of your work. Everyone should share in the ownership of labor. If Amazon right now went to a co-op system, Jeff Bezos would go from the richest man in the world to still pretty wealthy. Considering how many people are in that company and how broad, how much of a monopoly Amazon has become. And that's just one corporation compared to Walmart and all the other ones.
And you actually just brought up a good point, because Amazon actually went from giving stock incentives because of minimum wage rising up to $15. They said, okay, you can get a higher wage, but then now we're going to take your ability to get stock within our company.
Pensions and things like that, right? It's, and that's happening increasingly, and we're stifling unions, and we're not allowing labor to have a voice. And people, so there's a term that is not an economic term, it's a political term, and they call business owners job creators. A business owner is a job. Demand creates jobs. If there's no demand for a product, there's no job to be had.
That's true.
And it's really an immaterial thing that creates markets. And to call these people job creators is a false dogma that makes no fucking sense. They're not creating jobs. They're starting a business and then exploiting the labor system that is already the substrate of their ability to even start that business. Basically, it's subsidizing their own debt with the debt of other people. It's indebting people to their businesses and saying that, here, you get this salary, but it's a static salary that I will raise incrementally based on your ability to produce. But it's also arbitrary. You could produce a whole hell of a lot, but if they choose not to give you a raise, nothing's stopping them from not giving you one.
That is true. And also I feel like the reason why this is not happening is because people are afraid to say anything. There's a lawsuit within Albany Med, which is one of the biggest hospitals in the Albany area. that the Philippine nurses, because they're so used to just accepting the status quo, they basically were exploiting them as slave labor, and they weren't speaking out on it because they were just already so used to it, and also that just shows the problem that we actually have in America, especially with exploiting foreign labor. Even though that we're now under a current president, we're trying to basically ostracize the foreign workforce. But if you really think about it, what American is going to want to work in a lima bean field for 20 hours or 15 hours a day for $13 an hour?
Right. And if you distributed that labor, if the people that own the companies also worked in the fields, they would design it a lot more equitably. But when they don't have to, it reminds me a lot of generals in the army. They send all of the frontline soldiers into war while they sit safely behind the regiment, and it's a very similar thing. They're controlling, in terms of war production, the means of production. They're controlling how those people get distributed and what artillery they use, and strategically where they deploy, and all these things, while safely sitting in some bunker or some abstract area that they're unaffected by. And if they had stake in the game, if they were a soldier themselves, they wouldn't. It's like a game of chess in a way where they're considering everybody a pawn, and you could. There's a lot of examples like this: feudalism, mercantilism. There's a lot of things where you could use the term pawn or use the term slave. And I like to use the term slave because it has more of an impact in people's psyches, because they recognize slavery as wrong. And to your point, fear is the root of the problem, because they don't question these dogmas because they are afraid. And because they don't question these dogmas, they don't see themselves as slaves. They don't see themselves as people that are being used as pawns for other people's profit or gain or whatever it is. You may think of yourself on one hand as merely a consumer or a laborer that is, working to provide a home, but some kind of stable income for your family, and all those things are great, and maybe you think these people are smarter than you and they make better decisions. But when they decide to dump oil and waterways that get into your filtration systems and your home water, you're a victim of that. And a lot of people are subject to the cultural hegemony of the propaganda that we present to them. They just don't, people don't know what they don't know, as we were talking about off camera. And because they don't know it, they assume that the system's correct.
That brings up a good point. I was watching basically, wasn't a documentary, but it was a few people talking about how some states were putting harmful chemicals that actually were causing cancers and all these problems, and they didn't even know about it until those problems started coming up, and there was more deaths in this town from things that could easily have been prevented if, say, like, I know there was in one of the southern states, I'm not really sure which one, but like, basically there was no water filtration systems for that town, and basically the government was ignoring it, but we really could have prevented that, especially with how there's oil spills and how the environment is being polluted. Basically all that could be avoided, especially with how much information is really popping up about how to stop plastic pollution. There was a mushroom found in the Amazon rainforest that is called the Microsporus mushroom, and basically it could eat the petroleum within the plastic, and also you cannot find any of that toxicity from the plastic within the mushroom. So also it turned pollution into a reliable food source.
Okay.
But if you really think about why we're not actually going towards it, is because, one, it takes time to implement new systems, and really because we all have the mentality, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah. speaking of mycology and mushroom science, and bringing it back to Joe Rogan's podcast, did you watch the guy that, I can't remember his name,
Paul Stamets?
and he had the mushroom hat?
Yes, called the Amadou mushroom, and the Amadou mushroom was actually found within the Iceman. If you ever have you heard about the Iceman?
Yeah.
So basically, it's was used. They put like a tiny ember from a fire within that mushroom. It was a very slow burning mushroom, so that's how they were able to travel long distances and actually be able to start fires.
Oh, so it would insulate the fire and keep it burning?
Yes.
Oh, shit. Did you hear about the mushroom that I think is in Washington? It's the largest living organism. It's a network of mushrooms that are interconnected. It's the largest mushroom system on the planet. Largest living organism.
One of the things that we actually don't think about is that soil is actually 35% mycelium networks.
Okay.
And mycelium, there was a study in Tokyo where this is the reason why Tokyo has some of the city ecology to find out how to make traffic more efficient and stuff like that. They were studying mycelium networks, and they actually created a perfect grid to structure the city of Tokyo on to be able to improve on their own efficiency within traffic and like walkways and stuff like that. And if you really go off it, that mycelium is actually a lot like mammals in a way. It's very methodic.
Well, you may already know this, but we actually share more DNA with mushrooms than we do other plant life, and that mushrooms are more genetically identical to mammal DNA than they are plant DNA. That's a pretty interesting fact.
Actually, I did not know about that.
Yeah. Terrence McKenna, you heard him? He's very knowledgeable, and he's talked about ancient societies, and mushrooms have been a part of our culture for a long time. And I don't know enough I can only quote what he's talked about. I don't know enough to give details, but he's said that there's been some kind of symbiotic relationship between humans and mushrooms over all these, civilizations and time of advancement of humans. And he actually thinks that civilization arose because of the ingestion of mushrooms and the awakening that it was able to cause inside of humans.
From like what I've heard from Terrence McKenna, it actually kind of makes sense about how the mushrooms are creating new neural networks in our brains, and the ability that they were eating the psilocybin mushrooms and it was actually creating new thought process for them, and was able to bring more individuality to the consciousness, especially if you believe in evolution theory about us starting from apes, and what really separated us from other primates and other mammals was the ability to generate consciousness. Whether or not I believe in consciousness in animals to a certain extent, but we've separated ourselves from the primitive instinct, and that's really what's creating what people believe is the soul, or really what's giving an individuality to a human.
Aldous Huxley talks about the research in Indo-European I'm kind of conflating paleontology and archaeology right now, but he talks about it was pre-agricultural societies, pre-pastoral. So before agriculture, they were growing poppies, which is opium. And so he makes a point that we had an affinity for enhanced consciousness before we even cared about growing food, I think that ties into the point that Terrence McKenna has, is like we've had this stronger relationship with advanced consciousness than we have with perpetuating our means of survival. Right now, I think the reason we're regressing as a species, which we are, Aldous Huxley has another great point, and I'm going to paraphrase the shit out of it. It's a quote that I try to memorize it like several times, and for whatever reason I always paraphrase it in my mind. He essentially says technology only makes us more efficient at going backwards. And it's because we're offloading our consciousness onto systems and machines and things that are thinking for us. So there's that commercial that I hate from Google, and it's let Google do that for you, and it'll be very mundane tasks that they're showing. Like, it's kind of like those infomercials where they are trying to advertise some water hose or something. There's someone showing someone struggle with a water hose, and like, look how easy this is, and it's like, that person's an idiot though. Like, most people don't struggle with a fucking water hose. Like, so it's a gimmick to say, well, look at this one, it untangles on its own, which it may be a slight improvement, but it's not adding to the quality of life. You're still running water through a hose. It's a gimmick, and a lot of advancements, a lot of innovation. There's a book I have somewhere in here, right here. This is actually worth me going through this whole charade of moving these books to show this. This is an Economist. It's called, I'll show this, by Robert Gordon, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, the U.S. Standard of Living Since the Civil War. And he is saying that we had an industry boom, we had a lot of innovation, a lot of technology that sprouted out of necessity. And his arguments for it are saying that innovation was closely tied to solving problems, and now innovation is actually not advanced much. Like, one of the only things we can even point to is the internet, which has not really enhanced the quality of life. It's really just kind of connected us through communication more, but we still have high rates of poverty. We still have, it's like your phone. What is this really adding to your life?
Not too much.
And do you know the minerals that go into this phone are out of the Sahel region of West Africa? And it's actually people that are, it's, again, slave labor, where they're being abused and forced to go into these horrible mines to extract these minerals. And we don't think about it when we use a phone. Yeah.
Especially with like lithium batteries, it does more harm to the environment than all, say like 150 years of our eco footprint in the world.
I actually don't know about that. What's the harm caused by lithium batteries?
Because you strip so many minerals from the earth to actually make one battery, and then they don't have a reliable process to recycle that battery.
Okay.
So a lot of it is going to waste.
That makes me curious, and it could be just an ignorance of broader science on my part, but I wonder if that affects the electromagnetic spectrum in some way. Like, there's a bird, the European robin, that actually can detect gravitation. Electromagnetic waves, and it uses that to navigate. There's another cool book. It's upstairs called I'm gonna just go ahead and paraphrase it. It's like Biology on the Edge, but it's not. Well, it's about quantum biology, which is actually an idea that Erwin Schrödinger had in a book he wrote. It's an essay he wrote called "What Is Life," and no one grabbed onto it. It's a burgeoning science now, but no one saw the empirical evidence of it, so they didn't take him seriously when he was saying, quantum effects may affect our biology. There may be something that we can do. Now they've done studies where they actually do see this. So, like, mice use their sense of smell for navigation.
Okay.
If you put a magnet on their head, they no longer have that ability. It disrupts their ability to sense through smell whatever they're able to navigate with. And smell itself relies on molecular receptors in your neurology to, you've got these receivers that take in those molecules and then construct in your mind a sense of smell, whatever it is. And then going back to the European robin, that is also a quantum biology where it's actually in their, I think it's their iris, where they're actually able to detect a certain photochemical in the electromagnetic field that most people, humans, animals, whatever, can't detect, but they can. So it's a rare thing that only these birds can, only European robins, I mean, maybe there's other birds that do it, but they know for sure these do. Photosynthesis. photons entering a chlorophyll use quantum tunneling, they suspect, to find the most efficient path for that photon. And light. I've always thought it'd be cool if you could somehow genetically modify a human to use light as a food source, and then you don't rely on taking resources. I mean, plants are the most efficient living creatures. They've been around forever. They're going to exist long after us, and it's interesting because light is their food source. I mean, of course, nutrients and soil and things like that. I won't boil it down to just light, but there's plenty of plants like phytoplankton, all light. It doesn't need.
True, that's true. Just kind of makes me remember how in tune animals are with the world and how it's actually set up, and how like coal miners were using canaries to figure out if there was
I didn't know that was. I thought it was a saying based on the canary in the coal mine. I didn't know they actually used canaries. Like that was a thing that they actually did.
Yeah, to find the gas leaks and to know.
I thought it was just happenstance. I thought maybe they just found a dead canary and
then PETA came along, but
but they purposely put canaries in.
Yeah, they would have they would bring the canaries.
I didn't
down
know it was intentional. I thought they would just find a canary dead in the coal mine and be like, yeah, there's a gas leak there. What's funny is canary in the coal mine is proto bug in the system, right? So when I was actually thinking about this today, insurance companies, the fact that health insurance is a thing to me is a bug in the system. It's saying that system doesn't provide health care, so it needs health insurance, but it shouldn't need health insurance. That health insurance is showing you that there's a bug that needs to be corrected. But now it's such a big industry that our economy is largely relying on it. I personally, I've already exposed so many controversial views, so I'll go ahead and say this one. I don't think that we need the stock market. I think it should be abolished. A lot of people say, well, you need venture capital, you need people to invest in products, and my argument to that is make a good fucking product that sells itself. How about you just have something that's worth fucking having? And if the rest of us don't agree on it, maybe it's not worth having. But now you've got marketing and stock. I mean, look at how many people capitalize on doom and gloom. You have
that's what I was going to bring up. A point is that the health insurance and basically the fact that we have insurance is really just preying on people's fear of death. It's just like, oh, I might need this because...
Which is more abstract than actually preying... It's even worse than that because it's actually preying on their physical well-being. It's preying on the fact that motherfuckers get sick.
Yeah, it's true. Have you looked into the stock market? Did you know that basically in the Netherlands...
No, I've never heard of it. No. I want it abolished and I know nothing about it.
But how the fact that it started with tulips and you're basically options trading and you're basically, the fact that, tulips were...
It was a boom, right?
It started a boom, but the fact that in Europe there was no tulips, but then the fact that of them selling it through the market, basically when they brought it to Europe, because of a mutation, it basically created more unique tulips. So then that brought more value to the tulip market. So basically people were basically selling the right to buy tulips.
Mm-hmm.
And
so I don't know how that ties into the stock market because as far as I understand the stock market, it was actually an artificial creation by bankers that wanted to centralize banks, and they wanted to centralize commerce, and so they created the stock market. And I think, based on my knowledge, and you may know more than me, I do know about the tulip boom, but I thought that was like, what is it, 1500s, 1600s or something like that?
Yeah.
And that was long before at least the American stock market.
But
maybe the stock exchange, because there's always been a stock exchange. Where
more of a stock exchange, but then we kind of just adapted that, and now we have the stock market.
Which may be similar terms, exchange market, it's kind of the same thing. But yeah, what I'm saying is maybe what you're talking about is an organic stock exchange, stock market, whereas the actual stock market was contrived. It was something that bankers colluded to create so that they could control money markets. That's my understanding of it. But also, that's my limited understanding of it.
That's why we need Jamie. Look this up.
Yeah. Who the fuck's Jamie at? Joe Rogan. He's balding.
He's balding. It's kind of just crazy to see him go from Fear Factor all the way to now he's everyone's choice of media.
But it's also a metaphor because he uses the fear factor to
He's the Fear Factor.
obtain his audience. I think that Joe Rogan does provide a civil service that he shouldn't provide, that is informational. But there's a good quote by Mark Twain, one of my favorite authors and philosophers, and he says, if you I'm going to paraphrase again. I always remember these quotes, but I remember them in my own way. But it's like, if you follow the media, if you don't read the news, you're uninformed. If you do read the news, you're misinformed. And that's my problem with Joe Rogan. There's a lot of misinformation. Going back to what we were talking about before with pretending that the iPhone is a capitalist invention, the iPhone would have never existed without the social infrastructure, socialist infrastructure,
Yeah.
the public funded infrastructure behind it. Same thing with the military. Everything, duct tape they brag about coming from the military, well, it was developed in the public sector. The military itself is the public sector. The military doesn't exist without our tax dollars. I'm a fucking recipient of... It's funny because people are all down with the VA because I put my life on the line. You shouldn't have to fucking sacrifice yourself to get health care. And like, I'm living pretty well because I served in the military and I really didn't have any problems. A lot of people laud the military. I know people that were on my base that went into Tijuana, killed hookers, and wrote nasty messages with their blood on the walls. Because in the military, you got the same people you got in the civilian side. And so we glorify the military as if they're somehow deified outside of the human complex and system. And they're coming out of it. A lot of people join the military, including me, because they didn't know what else they were going to do, and they had made a bunch of mistakes. And I mean, I went to jail when I was in the military. I spent 30 days for 2 DUIs that I got back to back, and I got away with the first one because I was in the military. And the judge said he knocked it down to something like he was able to knock it down to like reckless driving or something like that, and I was able to pay a fine and get away with it, essentially, not even have it on my record. But I got unlucky, and I got my second one like 6 months later, and that judge goes, "Weren't you in here 6 months ago?" And then he goes, and he gave me an ultimatum. He said that I could take all these driving courses and pay a big fine, or I could do 30 days in jail. And being the frugal and fiscally responsible person I am, I chose 30 days in jail, which was an eye-opening experience, but I immediately regretted it. I couldn't believe, like, I was getting handcuffed by the bailiff and taken away, and I had a dude that was my representative in the military, like my mentor. He took me to the court hearing, and he didn't expect me to go to jail either, and he actually yelled at the judge. He goes, "Because you can't do this." He goes, "I got to take him back to the base." And the judge goes, "Do you want to go too?" And he goes, "No, sir."
I want to go too.
So it was a very surreal experience for me, like, being handcuffed, unfortunately it wasn't my first time being handcuffed, being led into the court jail, and then realizing that the next 30 days I was going to be in jail. And what's funny is I was in California, and I went to 5 different jails because of deportation. There's a lot of Hispanics and Mexicans that end up going to jail as illegal immigrants, and it was really crazy. Like, in the morning, you would hear them come over the fucking PA, and they would just start saying Gonzalez, Morales, blah, 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 just start naming people, and you see all these Hispanic guys get up in line, and they were just deporting them. And the prisons, or the jails, are filling up so fast. Thankfully, there is a difference between prison and jail. I found that out pretty quick. I ended up going to George Bailey, which is a notorious, like, bad jail, and it's close to the Mexican border.
Okay.
I only spent one night there, but while I was there, like, it was like a fucking movie, dude. You walk in, and you've got this huge, like, hall of 2-decker cells that are kind of going in a rectangle, and people were throwing toilet paper and just, like, yelling and screaming. Someone got shanked while I was there, and I was just, like, so fucking scared. And I have my little roll-up with my mat and my pillow, and I got put in a room with another dude who ended up being an alright guy. But I remember the guards were watching TV while I was in that jail, and I was so nervous about being there that I just stood on the toilet and watched the TV that they were watching out of the little window I had, and it was like my solace. And luckily, the next day, that was George Bailey, and I went to already Ventura, California jail. I can't even remember. I went to 5 total jails. I just remember that. Um, and when I was in George Bailey, I just remember being so frightened by the place because it's just extreme. I met a fucking legitimate cartel drug dealer son, and he was young, but you could just tell by his haircut and his demeanor, like this dude knew that his dad was going to pay for him to get out. Was telling me about like how he smuggles things over the border, and he was like, I actually was impressed by him. To tell you the truth, like he was an entrepreneur. Like this dude had things figured out. I learned about from another guy in that same, and this is all George Bailey, this one crazy ass jail. I learned from another dude like how DMT is activated and how it's in most plants, and he told me how I could grow it. I don't remember all the details he told me at the time, but I got some prison knowledge, wasn't it? But I ended up going to another place that's even closer, San Ysidro, California, which is right on the border. And they called it Camp Snoopy. That's the place I was at.
Camp Snoopy.
And it actually was, and that's where I spent the majority of my time. It actually was better than the other ones that I went to because it was like a dorm. It was like a cabin that you stayed in. And the guards would stay in their shack. They weren't in that same place. If you want to pivot over here, I think you probably do know more. It's just generating that might be difficult if you don't have like a end goal of where you're going.
Yeah,
I'm a weird person that doesn't really think about like what the end game of what I'm saying is. So I can borrow off of that, and maybe that will trigger some thoughts for you that you can elaborate on. Because one of the things you were talking about with they call them blood boys, right? And one thing I know about stem cells is to have effective stem cells, they should be pluripotent, meaning that they're not. So everything in your body, from your skin to your bones to your hair, is all based on pluripotent stem cells that then turn into hair cells or bone cells or skin cells. And so one of the things I do know is actually your chromosomal infrastructure inside of the nucleus of your cell has telomeres at the ends of the chromosomes, and the longer the telomere, the longer your lifespan. And while you've got pluripotent stem cells, I'm not sure what science they think is going to lengthen their age through stem cells. I don't know enough about that to say that it's actually effective, but I do know that if you really want to extend your life, you have to find a way to extend the telomeres of the chromosomes inside of your cell nucleus. Have you ever heard that Henrietta Sacks, the immortal cells that they were cancer cells, but they had long telomeres and they wouldn't die, and that was part of the reason that there's a whole background about how they harvested them illegally, you could say, because they didn't get any permission, and she was black, and there was like
okay, yes, I am familiar with that. Yes.
Yeah. As soon as I say black, yeah, I do. No, I'm kidding. But so going back to this stem cell thing, were you going to tie it back into like the Impossible Burger or food or things?
Well,
because this is actually where off camera they don't see this, but we disagreed about whether or not food cultures, growing food from stem cells, is a good thing. You said you didn't agree with it, but I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, I feel like I don't agree with going that route is because really we just need to find a way to reduce waste before we're actually moving towards, because like that brings in the whole process of GMOs. And another thing about like what I think is weird about stem cells is that making it illegal is actually just creating more of a black market for it. So there was a doctor that was just arrested. He had over 1,000 fetuses in his was found in his house, but what I think he was actually doing was he was selling it within the black market.
So your problem the stem cell, or is it how it's acquired?
I feel like it's how we are just we are avoiding the scientific discovery. We're basically putting all these laws to limit scientific production, just like how like with chemistry, in the 80s and 70s, you can actually go to your pharmacist and they would give you all the chemicals you need to, like, say, like, make LSD or make like a whole bunch of other drugs.
Yeah.
And basically, by putting laws, we're actually just inhibiting scientific research.
So what's funny to me is you're making a point that seems to relate to the scientism argument I was making, which is that science can be just as dogmatic as religion if improperly um, uh, uh, um, not implied, but not improvised. What's another word? Improperly performed. Let's just say that. Um, so I was actually going to play devil's advocate to my own argument with the food culture thing, but then you, in my opinion, kind of reversed it by saying that um, there's actually constraints on science, which could actually vault scientism, in my opinion, based on what you're saying.
Yes.
And I don't think that's a good thing, actually, because I think constraints should be on science. They should be moral constraints. So I was going to make an argument about why I think food cultures are a good thing, and hear what your argument against it is. It could be technical, it could be moral. I just want your opinion either way. The reason I think food cultures are a good thing is because right now the way that we generate meat is through a whole cow, and cows excrete, and the methane that is released from cow feces is, they call it CO4. There's probably a more technical term, but it's basically twice as bad as carbon dioxide. And it actually has a harsher effect on the atmosphere and things. So the way that we're currently generating meat is deleterious to the environment, and it causes a lot of problems. Whereas I think a food culture, if you took a pluripotent stem cell from a cow cell. I don't know how they would actually grow the steak, the physical meat organism itself, but basically they would take pluripotent stem cells from a cow and grow meat from it. I see that as being the same thing as a cow generating its own meat. That's what's happening regardless, whether or not we're interfering with it. So it actually reduces all of the harmful effects of the cow. You could take it from the cow fetus. I'm sure that's how it would be extracted anyway. What's funny about your point about stem cells and abortion, where you tied that in, Nancy Reagan was against abortion until she found out that stem cells, I think it was Alzheimer's that Reagan had, and how it could actually help him, and all of a sudden she was for collecting fetus stem cells. So, which would mean that you're pro-abortion, because a lot of fetus tissue comes from abortion. The point that I'm making, that I'd like to see where your argument is isn't cultivating a food culture from the stem cells of the cow better on the environment than...
Okay, so putting the argument about the environment aside, I do agree with what you're saying, but going back to like the scientific limitations is that, one, human studies are banned until a certain amount of approval. So basically, like what they found with the Impossible Burger is that the certain proteins that they were being created through the process of making the alternative meat source was actually making people gain more weight and actually causing people to have more health problems.
So you're saying we don't know the second and third order effects of genetically modified organisms?
Yeah, so like basically it may be okay now, but 10 years later from now we might actually find that it causes cancer. We might find that it actually creates birth defects. We don't actually know, because we weren't actually meant to be, just like how with the GMO argument. GMOs are good for, preserving the longevity of plants and actually making it more efficient, but also it's also creating a lot of reverse reactions within our own body. Is that our body probably is, what's the good word for it? It's not accepting unnatural forms of what we're putting in our body. Basically, we are already feeding it tons of bad shit, which is also probably affecting our lifespan. It's also affecting our quality of life in a way where, if we actually do go off and everyone is starting to be Oh, okay. It may reduce more more effect with the greenhouse effect within like reducing the methane gas being produced by cows, but also the problem is not with necessarily we are overproducing cows, but also we are wasting just as much meat within. We just need to find the happy medium where we're producing it, but it's also not creating an effect in the. We can also, if we can find a way to counteract the effects that it's doing to our environment to where it's non-existent, is actually more of a focus. Should be more of a focus in actually creating that alternative. 'Cause there's still going to be the God-fearing Christians that say, "I want a steak on Sunday with GMO potatoes and meat and stuff like that."
All right. So going back to Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom I have a nuanced and ambivalent view about. On one hand, I appreciate him as a popularizer of physics, whether it be astrophysics or quantum physics. He's good at compartmentalizing and
Putting it in layman
conceptualizing
terms.
it into ways that the common person can understand, which I think is important. But people confuse him as an expert on more topics than he actually has knowledge of, and he has spoken about GMOs. And so this is going to tie into some sympathies with your view and then some antipathies with your view. The sympathy is he said that you should not fear GMOs because plants, tomatoes, whatever it is, themselves have been genetically modified over time because we selected artificially tomatoes that produced riper fruit, whatever the thing is, based on what was appropriate for human consumption and what our needs were, taste, whatever it is. That I think may be sympathetic to what you're saying about the proper implementation maybe of GMOs, where it's still using the same organism. What he is neglecting in the GMO argument is that we are not using tomatoes and creating hybrid tomatoes. We're using tomatoes and maybe a fish that is resistant to bacteria or is resistant to chemicals that kill bugs. And then, so now you're splicing fish DNA with tomato DNA, and that is novel to. Actually, this may be even more sympathetic to your view where I disagree with them, which is where you and I would probably align here, is neglecting that part is saying that we don't know what the second and third order effects. So him just saying, don't worry about GMOs because tomatoes are genetically modified anyway. Well, they're genetically modified with other tomatoes. And today's like Monsanto or whoever it is now, Bayer, which is just fuck those people. Well, Monsanto for the DDTs that they released, that they actually used in cows who metastasize their udders so that they produce more milk. Actually, and DDT I don't think is the right thing. It was actually Agent Orange. They use that same chemical to bomb Cambodians and Laos and Vietnamese people. So anyway, that's already an unethical implementation of. This is unethical to do it to the fucking cows. But it's based for human consumption, and you could justify, well, we need more milk. So take that argument to the side. Where it's related is now you've got tomatoes that are spliced. I'm just using tomatoes as an example. That are spliced with fish DNA that we don't know what the second and third order effects are. So you're saying if we use these stem cells to create steak, it may in all pretenses be a steak. You can eat it. It has proteins and all these things. But not knowing how those stem cells are cultivated and not knowing how ingesting an artificial steak, so to speak, affects the human organism, like you were saying, the Impossible Burger makes you fat, has an unethical part. I can't disagree with that. So my ethical part is reducing the harm on the environment, but I think it's good that both of us are kind of have a polarized view coming from different perspectives, because you're saying, cool, it's good for the environment. How does it affect humans? That I can't answer. And was actually my problem with Tyson, is he's talking to people who go, well, he's great for popularizing science and he's a smart man, so he must have. It's like people who liked Ben Carson because he was a scientist, but this dude doesn't know shit about urban planning and development. Should not be in that role. Um, Ben Carson also doesn't believe in evolution, so it's fucking crazy. Anyway, he also believed that the pyramids were used for grain silos for Joseph. Like, he's fucking insane. So, I agree with you. I think that there does need to be more science on the human impact of food cultures. That part I agree with. So I think we kind of agree by coming to the middle of it. You agree with me on the environmental side, I agree with you on the human side, and how do we rectify those things with stem cells?
To expand upon the whole like splicing, say, fish DNA with tomatoes, is that one, just from knowing a lot about agriculture, is kind of just taking it, the agriculturalists are just being lazy in the fact that they don't want to go the natural route because it takes more time, it costs more money. So also, like with what you were saying about Monsanto has not done any human testing on the effect of pesticides.
I actually would argue that companies like Monsanto are not agriculturalists, that there's scientific technocrats, that they're more worried about the production and the means of producing these goods than an actual agricultural would take the more slow route of growing it themselves. And so like they're about whatever it takes, artificial, doesn't matter. And they're not thinking about second and third order effects. They're thinking about bottom line profits. And that is this ties all the way back into, I mean, we have covered probably a large gamut of like human society and how it's different systems integrate. Like this is a very holistic podcast. Yeah. And I think hopefully this one podcast and then the several others, once we dial in content, will be a good change to something like a Joe Rogan podcast where there isn't a point of view and there isn't he's not taking a whole, what's cool about him is also what sucks about him, which is he lets the guest say whatever they want to say, but at the same time he doesn't steer it in a way that creates that holism that we've kind of provided here. And I think what's cool about discussing things with you is we do disagree, but it's not a vehement disagreement where there's like emotion and it's just like honestly, I did not think about the human impact of the food cultures. I was just thinking about the environmental impact. So you brought a new perspective to me. I was like, oh shit, that's what an argument should do. And Joe Rogan is not providing that dissident point of view to his guest, which is challenging. He doesn't challenge them. He just goes, When he does, when he does challenge them, it comes from his limited frat bro persona that just has dogmas about things that he doesn't actually. Not to say that we know anything that he knows or doesn't know. Yeah. That some things he may be more informed about, but
like hunting,
all kinds of things. But his always seems to have a commercial aspect to it. He's marketing goods on his show. Like this is the cool thing about what we're doing. I mean, I'm probably putting my alcoholism on display here, and people are going to be like, this motherfucker poured himself a lot of drinks. But it's just about having a good time, and this is fun.
And another to
everybody's going
to top this off to finish it. So another thing about the environmental aspect of GMOs, stem cell culture is that it's actually having opposite effects in the environment in different ways. It's like how pesticides actually affect the bee populations and it's causing them to swarm more, which is actually killing them off. And how like basically they're saying, well, just don't have your beehives within a certain mile radius of agricultural facilities because it actually pesticides go upwind about a good 5-6 miles.
Right. They're not localized to just the things you spray them on. Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that I think it's a problem. I just think that it needs to be studied more, and I feel like there needs to be.
That's my philosophy too. So that's great. Yeah. What's funny though is you and I would probably fall into analysis paralysis where we'd be like, well, we need to study that more. Like before we get into the what's funny is I found the word I was looking for, implementation. Yes. I was saying all kinds of things, imps. No, but implementation is something that you and I may be reluctant to because of our holistic viewpoint where it's like, have you considered all the angles? And so it is weird because there is an element of pragmatism that should exist. Because you won't go anywhere without it. But at the same time, when there are flaws, when there are problems, so here's my perspective on it. Try the food cultures out. and maybe you take a risk, and maybe you have some motherfuckers develop some weird mutations. Um, when you see that happen, you go, something's wrong. Let's investigate this. The problem that I see a lot of times is we don't blame the system, and we blame the symptoms, and we go, well, that's that one person, or that's it. So, like, when I look at capitalism, a lot of people don't want to blame capitalism. They want to blame, they're like, capitalism works. It's greed that's the problem. You can't do anything about greed. That's outside the system of capitalism. If greed can hijack that system like a virus, hijacks a cell, or the cell's DNA to replicate itself, right? If greed can perpetuate inside of that system, there's a flaw that you have to correct. It may mean that capitalism is okay, but it needs a correction. And I find socialism to be that correction. I'm even fine with continuing to use the word capitalism and using socialist programs to correct for it. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool anarchist. The reason I lean towards those ideologies is I see them as corrections to the ills of capitalism that people don't want to correct for. They just want to assume that the dogma of capitalism is perfect. And that goes back to the cultural hegemony and just this dogmatic indoctrination that gets imposed on the population by their ingestion of propaganda, media, whatever those things are.
I'm sure for you, you're just basically, you also kind of want someone to give you a better argument about what is a better option versus like socialism, or like why anarchy won't work. And then like you probably be like, I see your point, and you probably would shift your own ideas to go around.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people the terms capitalism, socialism, any ism is a trigger word. And it doesn't actually, because they don't actually know the content of those things. So for me, I know the content of at least those three economic systems. There's more that we've had. We've had monarchies, we've had feudalism, we've had all the isms. Those are just words. There are ideologies behind those words, and if you don't know them, it doesn't make sense to be scared of them.
Yeah.
I'm not scared of capitalism, and I'm not pro-socialism in the entirety of either of those systems based on people's indoctrinated views of those things, based on the dogmas that are assigned to those. So when you say socialism, people think Soviet Russia. They don't think Robert Owen, who created socialism as a business owner, a textile factory in England in the mid-1800s, before socialism was ever a concept. And the way he developed it was he knew that he was profiting off of these people's labor. He went to their homes and saw that they were living in squalor, and he thought that was fucked up. And he said, man, here I am as an industrial capitalist making money off of these people, and they're not sharing in the wealth that I'm able to extract from them. So he started putting them on the boards of his decision making, and that's how there's a statue in England of Robert Owen, where it came from, that people just ignore and don't think about. But like the reason that statue was erected was socialism in France and Germany and places. Spain had a true anarchist revolt, really existing Catalonia, Spain, of anarcho-syndicalist communes that were resisting the fascism of Franco and the communism that was coming there, and both systems stamped it out. And the thing is everyone talks about the failure of socialism or anarchism, but they don't think about why they failed. It wasn't because they organically collapsed. They had outside pressure that collapsed them. It was fascism. It was capitalism. It was, we don't allow these things to flourish. We're so pissed off about Venezuela. And we don't think about the actual democracy that they have compared to the rest of South America. We don't want it to flourish. We don't want democracies in other countries because you can't regulate people that are regulating themselves. You want a right-wing dictatorship because they're going to put their people online, and they're going to serve your power interests. So as much as we pretend that we like democracy in America, we don't even have it at home.
Yeah, it's true.
So I'm kind of tired of this whole perpetuation of a myth that doesn't exist. And so for me, I'm willing to hear all the ideas, and I guarantee you there's some truth in all these ideas that we could, you could call it capitalism if that makes you feel good. But just
what I think is like really important is having checks and balances within these systems. It's just like you can have a communist regime, but if you don't have the proper checks and balances, it would just turn into another Nazi Germany.
Or communist Russia.
Communist Russia, yeah.
So a lot of people look at the left-right divide, and a way that is not true to how the actual terms came about. So left actually came from the French Revolution, and you had people that were in support of the monarchy, the status quo, that were on the right side of Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
And you had people on the left side of Parliament. It was the early burgeoning of democracy inside of France, because you had Napoleon, right? Before that, you had these emperors of France, and it was that's as authoritarian as you can get. That's fascism before fascism, which actually fascism came from Rome. A lot of people don't sign.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. In fact, a fasces is a bundle of sticks that I can't remember the significance of it, but I know a fasces is this. We can either edit this or come back to it in another topic. I just know what the symbol of fascism is. In fact, a lot of people don't know this. In our own House of Representatives, where we have fasces on the molding of the walls behind us, and Abraham Lincoln's hands in the Lincoln Memorial are resting on fasces. So there was a bundle of sticks with an axe in the middle of it, and it's supposed to represent power. Now it's all coming to me. And we have these in our symbols. We're supposed to be a democracy, but we use fascist symbols in our representations. Symbology is a huge thing that people ignore. People don't realize how much symbols control their psyche. That's another podcast. So anyway, to get to this whole point, an ideology on its own has inherent flaws, because the person who develops that ideology, or a group of people, are humans, and humans are flawed. We continue to seek perfection, and the only perfect thing that I can think of is a crystal, right?
Okay.
Because it resists entropy. But the universe is entropic by nature, and in fact, you would not have developing systems without entropy. Without decay, you can't have creation. Without something destroying, you can't have something creating. So a crystal is a perfectly formed organism that has its, finite crystallization where it reaches this endpoint, and it's forever that thing. That, to me, would not be perfect. There's no growth in a system that's perfect. Growth comes from turmoil and revolution. So it's funny, because a lot of people are like, well, Bernie's going to lose the election. That doesn't mean that his ideals have died.
Yeah.
He's got already the DNC. They're talking about healthcare in a way that they never would have done without him. He is a representative of a larger movement that's going to happen. I always say socialism is going to happen out of necessity, not out of want. People don't want socialism, but the New Deal happened because of the Great Depression. Social programs that bailed everybody out. So we bail out banks because right now we can. Eventually, banks are going to get so greedy. That's exactly what led to the Great Depression. The robber barons, the oil barons, the people that own. So I looked this up recently, who the first billionaire was. It was John D. Rockefeller. And even to this date, he is the richest man in the world. If you use the ratio of how much wealth he had.
And how much monopoly he had over, everything that he was in business in. He owned the railroad, he owned every process from A to B to creating his products.
Yeah, still to this day, the richest man that's ever lived. And so that led to the Great Depression. And they used to water down stocks, where they would, and that watering down came from what they would do with transporting cows, because you would trade cows at one point, and what they would do is they would starve cows, and then fatten them up with water to sell them and make them look like they were not anemic. And so people would buy them at a high price, take these cows home, and they were cheap goods. Capitalism relies on obsolescence, scarcity, and rarity. Those are three things that I learned in microeconomics course. Those three things. We ignore those things as if the market regulates them, but it doesn't. Because if you're going to be profitable, you need to. There are diamond manufacturers that blow up their own diamond mines to continue the rarity of diamonds. Apple had a lawsuit recently because they were using firmware to obsolete their phones.
Yeah, I have heard about
So,
that. Yeah.
so we have this scarcity, rarity, and obsolescence built into capitalism. You don't make profit. I can just go on and on about this. We'll wrap it up. But
Basically, I feel like the importance is regulation, and without regulation, we won't be able to succeed as a country permanently. Just like you said about the entropy.
Entropy, yeah.
Entropy, yes. Like going back on like anarchists taking over. King Louis in France, he made the guillotine. He was executing people by the guillotine.
He invented the guillotine?
Yes, then he ended up dying by that guillotine when they overthrew his court. So,
okay,
just ironic. It's irony at its finest. But without that, we wouldn't be able to see the France that we have today. And
there's this quote, and it's really interesting because he was a French revolutionary. And I might be falsely attributing it to him, but I remember this was very powerful for me reading. The person himself, I know, was an interesting character, and he may or may not have said this. I'm saying this because people can fact check me. His name was
Jamie.
Yeah. His name was Anacharsis Clootz.
Okay.
It's a funny ass name, but it's funny because Anacharsis is like anarchy, right? But he was a French revolutionary. He was against the monarchy. But he was guillotined. I do know that. I do know he was executed for his revolutionary activities and viewpoints. One of the most gangster fucking things I think has ever been uttered, if it was him that said this, said, the problem with the world is not enough people are willing to die by the guillotine. Boom, head cut off. That was his last words. Now, if that was him, that's great. I'm right.
Right?
Regardless, if nobody said that shit, that's some gangster ass shit to say. I agree with it. Not enough people are willing to sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good. Not enough people are willing to die by the guillotine, because you don't have revolutions, you don't have change without death, decay, entropy, loss,
sacrifice.
Right, and so anybody who says they're progressive but does it on Twitter, fuck that person.
And this is our first podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. We appreciate all your support. Thank you.
I wish I knew some gangster symbols, man. Some street signs, man.